Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how to divide a chive plant. This way you can get more plants and you can also make sure your plants are healthier. So I'll go into first of all the reasons why it's a good idea to divide them. If you just want to quickly skip ahead to where I actually divide them, then you can find it in the chapters. So basically, when it comes to chives, they're a clump forming plant, and what happens is over time you'll get a thicker and thicker clump, and it's basically just lots of little chive plants, and they just keep dividing and get a really dense clump like this. When you get them from the shop, there'll probably be hundreds of seedlings, so you can actually divide them straight away if you want to, or even if you just start with 1 or 2 plants, they'll eventually become like this, a really thick dense clump. And the problem with this is what happens over time is you get hundreds of plants, there's very little room, they're all competing for light and they're all competing for moisture and nutrients as well from the roots. So although they might still be growing fairly healthily, their growth will really slow down, and if you want to get much more plants, what will happen with this is it will just slowly clump out sideways. But if you want to get a lot more plants, what you need to do is separate them, give each individual plant a lot more space. That way it will grow a lot quicker because it will have the nutrients and the light it needs to grow quickly. So the first thing you want to do when it comes to separating the chives is actually to cut off a lot of the foliage. The reason for this is you're going to disturb the roots. The roots are actually very fragile and brittle on chive plants, so you'll lose most of the roots in the process of separating them. Even if you keep a lot of them, they'll be badly damaged. So there's a lot of foliage to keep green, and it has to suck up a lot of moisture from its roots to do that. So if you take off a lot of the foliage, it puts on less stress on the roots, and it'll be able to cope better with the transplanting. So you want to leave some of the leaves so it can still photosynthesize, but you just want to take off the bulk of it, and it also makes it a bit easier to separate because there's a bit less leaves to manage with. So what I tend to do is cut down to about 10 centimeters, leaving about 10 centimeters of leaf. So ideally using sharp scissors, you just want to go in and just cut them back. So then you should be left with a plant that looks like this. And so the next stage is to take it out of the pot and have a look at the roots and get it ready for separation. Now if you're digging it out of the soil, what you want to do is just dig around and get as much roots out as possible. If it's in a pot like this and it's been a long time, you might find that the roots are really solid and you can't pull the plant out. What you can do is roll it and put a lot of pressure on it at the same time. That will just loosen up the roots and also hit on the very bottom of the pot just to push out the bottom of the roots and get it a bit more loose. So if your plant's been doing well and it's in the right type of soil, it should look like this. It should be a mass of white roots, and there shouldn't be any dead or dying or rotting roots. They should all be healthy, such as this. If you find that they are rotting and they're not healthy, it's either been in the pot for too long or it needs better drainage and the roots have been rotting off. And if you do see them quite as intense with this and like this, and you don't see any compost, such as the bottom area or this here, it definitely means it needs repotting. If it's a bit more like this and you can see some compost, then it's not too desperately needing repotting. There's a couple of ways you can separate these plants. One way is just to get a spade and cut it in half, and then you can quarter it or half it and just cut it off into various sections. That's handy if you just want 1 or 2 extra plants, you just want to separate the clumps into smaller clumps, or if you've got quite a small clump already, you don't want to have to make it too tiny, then you can just cut it up with a spade or a trowel. But what I'm going to show you in this video is how you can separate individual plants, and that way if you want to rapidly get a lot more chives, you can very quickly propagate your chives into hundreds of little plants just from one clump like this. So if you're using the trowel method or the spade method, you just want to kind of lay the plant on its side and just start cutting through the middle and try to work the spade or the secateurs through any of the plants so you're not actually damaging any of them. So that would be the simplest method, just cutting them in half and then you've got 2 plants. But if you actually want to separate them further, then you can start teasing them out. So the bottom half of the roots I wouldn't worry about, you'll lose that anyway. You just want to start on the edge, start ripping off bits of soil, bits of root, until you get to a section where there's a plant. And then you just want to carefully tease that out if you can, trying to keep as much root as possible. So this one here is a good example. You just want to tease that out, try and keep those roots. And then you have a small root system there which you can then plant up. But one way that makes this a little bit easier is if you have to get a bucket of water and rinse all the soil off with the water. So first of all, I would actually take off a lot of the existing soil at the bottom. There's a small bulb in each of the chive plants, so they can lose quite a lot of root and a lot of leaf without it being a major issue. So you can see the small bulb there. So don't worry too much if you're losing a lot of root and quite a bit of leaves. They can hold a lot of moisture and nutrients inside the bulb. So to cut off a lot of the roots to begin with, and then just makes it easier for rinsing out the soil when it comes to the water method. So once you've got your plants down to something like this, it's then time to put it in the water. And what this does is it really helps to loosen up the roots, makes it much easier for separating the plants. So you just want to dip it in, let it soak for a few minutes, and then you just want to start kind of moving it around, pulling apart of the soil with your hands, and eventually you'll be able to work through the soil. Now it does depend how well rooted it is. This is a very well rooted plant, so it'll take a bit more work, but generally you just keep doing that until you feel the soil starting to get loose. The soil should start to come off, and then you can separate individual plants that way. So it will take quite a while, but what you should get eventually is something like this, where it's mainly just roots and not much soil. What you can then do is start separating them. Sometimes it's a bit tricky to separate one at a time, so it tends to be easier just to keep halving them as you go along. And then once you've got to a smaller clump size, it should be like this, and it should be a lot easier to actually separate the roots. So again, take off any of the excess roots at the bottom, because these will actually just be tangled together and very hard to separate. And then with these plants, you just want to gently loosen them up in the water, and eventually you should be able to start pulling off individual plants. So with a bit of time and patience, what you should eventually end up with is something like this. So it basically looks like lots of little spring onions. You can see the roots at the bottom there. You've got the stem and the leaves. Some of them like this, they're just starting to separate. You can actually tease them apart if you want, separate them into individual plants like that. As long as you've got a few roots on them and you've got some leaves as well, these will be fine. Don't worry too much if you lose most of the roots. It's very difficult to keep all the roots because the roots are very brittle and they really do twine together. But if you can, keep the roots, and then that's ready for planting. So what you should be left with is this. This is basically the three different methods. If you just cut the clump in half, it should look like this. If you carefully tease out an individual plant, it will look like that. And if you really work hard with the water and get them individually separated, you should have plants like this. So I'll just show you now what it's like to plant up these individual plants. So if you've done something as simple as just splitting the clump in half, you can probably just put it back into its original pot. What you want to do is you want to put the compost around about the level it was before. So any of these reddish stems, you want the soil just about up to that. Basically you want this very small bulb section covered, and you want all the green section left above ground. Any of these yellow sections as well, keep them above ground. So generally about this level here. They are underground bulbs, but they don't grow very deep underground, so you just want to very shallowly cover them with soil. When it comes to compost, it doesn't matter too much. They're very forgiving plants. They don't mind soil from the garden, they don't mind multi-purpose compost, as long as it retains water well, because these plants, what they really don't like is dry spells, and if it dries out too much, they'll just go dormant. They won't normally die, but they'll go dormant and they'll stop producing leaves. So make sure you've got a rich mixture that holds plenty of moisture, and make sure you've got holes in the pot so it's free draining. These do like a damp compost, but if the soil is too wet, then they can lead to root problems with it rotting. But generally, as long as excess water can drain out the bottom, it shouldn't be a problem. So this is the one that I've actually cut in half. I could actually quarter this, because even though this is going back into its original pot, you can see it's still quite compacted in there. I'm just going to put this in here for reference and fill this in around the edges. Now it's also good at this stage, if you do see any weeds, take them out, especially grass. One of the biggest problems with chives is grass looks just like chives, so when you're harvesting it you might accidentally harvest grass as well. And once grass gets mixed in amongst the roots, it's almost impossible to take out. So if you are separating it, using the water method is quite good for that, because then you can definitely make sure you've got the chives, and you can also smell the leaves on it, and then you can tell if it's a chive or if it's grass. So really do make sure you get rid of all the grass, because once it's into your pot of chives, you can't really get rid of it unless you separate it completely using the water method. So that's it now planted back into its original pot. I've just made sure that the compost is slightly firm down around it. You don't want to pack it in too hard, because you still need the soil to be loose enough for the roots to grow through, but you just don't want any air gaps. So make sure you've got any air gaps filled in, and that's pretty much it. Just need to give that a good watering. I'll now go on to the other ones. So a small individual one like this with its roots existing is pretty much the same method as that one there. So I'll now talk about the individual plants that have been separated using the water method. So these plants are a little more delicate, the roots are exposed. When you are doing this, make sure you don't do it in direct sunlight. Make sure it's in a cool, shady location, because once you've got the roots exposed, they can dry out within minutes on a warm, sunny day, especially if there's any wind, and then they'll die off. It probably won't kill the plant, because it does store a lot of moisture in the bulb, but it will just really set it back, and you might find a lot of the leaves die back before it then suddenly starts to recover and grow new roots. So do be careful with that. When you are transplanting it, don't worry too much if you damage the roots, but what you really don't want to damage is this little bulb section in the middle here. You can damage the leaves a little bit as well. As long as that bulb's protected, that's the main thing. So that's the bit you really want to be careful with. So with burying this one, you can see there's a little brown section there. Now some of them might not have that brown section if it's been removed whilst you were digging it up. So what you want to do is, if it does have that brown section, that's about the depth you want to bury it. If that's been lost and you're not sure where it is, as long as it's buried somewhere between the section where it starts to get narrow, like around about here, and before it starts to open up into individual leaves there. So that's kind of your leeway. There's quite a bit of variance to how deep you can plant it. Ideally I would only just bury it so that the roots are about 2 or 3 centimeters underground. As I say, these aren't a deep growing bulb, they only just grow slightly under the surface. So when you come to planting up these ones, it's just slightly different. You just want to hold it in place around about the right height, and then just put the compost around, and you'll need to support it the whole time because it doesn't have any soil on it. It will just kind of fall to the side. So you just want to do it like that. Hold it in place. And that's basically all you need to do. So this method, you won't get a nice pot of chives for probably about a year or two. But if you want to rapidly get loads of chives really quickly, this is the quickest method to do it, because each plant has loads of space, lots of light. It's not competing for light, it's not competing for moisture or nutrients, so this will grow much quicker than a clump of normal chives, and this will quickly fill up this whole pot and become a nice clump of chives within a year or two. So I'll now talk about how to look after the chives once they're planted up. The first thing you want to do is give them a really good water. That will do two things. Firstly, it will help any of the soil wash into the roots and help make sure there's not any air spaces, so the roots are nicely covered with compost. And secondly, it will just make sure they're well watered. The roots are going to be slightly damaged, they're going to struggle to uptake any moisture, so they really need to make sure that it's nice and damp so that they don't dry out too quickly until the roots get re-established. Now where you want to look after these is somewhere that's a little bit sheltered, not too windy, not too much direct sunlight as well, but plenty of bright light. They don't want bright sunshine because they'll dry out quite quickly until the new roots are established, but you don't want them anywhere too dark so they can still photosynthesize and create energy and start growing again. So keep them somewhere sheltered. Once you start seeing some good new growth coming through, then put them back to where you were growing them before, somewhere nice and sunny, ideally in a slightly cooler position. If you're in a hot country, they don't like hot summers and they tend to go dormant in the hot summer. If you're somewhere like the UK which has cooler summers, then a bright sunny location is perfect, and you just want to keep them well watered, and they should start growing away quite quickly and quite happily. So what I'll do now is I'll put these under a time lapse just so you can see how they do, and so you know what kind of regrowth you should expect. What you should find is lots of new leaves will start coming up. They'll probably sit there doing nothing for a few days. That's whilst the roots are getting established. They are fairly quick growing plants though, so it will only take probably a week or two until the roots get grown, and then they'll start putting up new top growth and new leaves. But you won't find them clumping up probably for at least a few months, because what they need to do is first of all re-establish their root system and also re-establish their leaves, and then once that's happened, then they can start clumping up and you'll get a nice clump within a year or two.